At 07:55 hours on the morning of August 15th, 1942, something impossible enters Grand Harbor at Valletta, Malta. The tanker Ohio is not sailing. She is not being towed in any conventional sense. She is being held together by two destroyers lashed to her sides like crutches supporting a dying man. Her back is broken. Her keel fractured in two places. Her engine room flooded. Her stern sitting so low that seawater laps across her afterdeck. She has been torpedoed, bombed, strafed, and had two aircraft crash directly onto her deck. By every engineering calculation, she should be on the bottom of the Mediterranean. But 11,000 tons of kerosene and diesel fuel rest in her tanks. Fuel that will determine whether Malta survives or surrenders. Fuel that will dictate the outcome of the North African campaign and, possibly, the entire Mediterranean theater. The Ohio is held together now by nothing more than the will of her crew and the steel of her escorts. When the destroyers HMS Penn and HMS Ledbury ease her the final yards into harbor, a band begins playing Rule Britannia, then falls silent. Men remove their hats. Women cross themselves. A bugle sounds still. This should not have worked. In late July 1942, the island of Malta was starving, not metaphorically, literally starving. The British Crown colony sat 122 square miles of rock in the center of the Mediterranean, 58 miles south of Sicily, equidistant between Italy and North Africa. For 2 years, the Luftwaffe and Italian Air Force had bludgeoned the island in an attempt to pound it into submission. The Maltese and British defenders endured what would become the longest sustained aerial bombardment of the war. By July, the island's 40,000 residents survived on 1,500 calories per day. The garrison of 20,000 British troops fared little better. Malta's value was not defensive. Malta was a knife pointed at the throat of Axis supply lines to North Africa. Torpedo bombers and submarines operating from the island maintained the only effective striking force against convoys supplying Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps. Through 1941 and into 1942, Malta-based squadrons sank approximately 75% of Axis shipping destroyed by aircraft. In June 1941 alone, British forces sank 220,000 tons of Axis shipping on African convoy routes. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Malta supplied meant Rommel starved. Malta neutralized meant Rommel advanced. In summer 1942, Rommel stood 35 miles from Alexandria. The Suez Canal lay within his grasp. He required supplies. Malta prevented those supplies from arriving. By late July 1942, Malta possessed 80 fighters averaging wastage of 17 aircraft per week. The remaining aviation fuel sufficed only for fighters. No fuel remained for bombers or torpedo bombers. No fuel meant no offensive operations. No offensive operations meant Rommel received supplies. Malta's strategic value evaporated without fuel to launch aircraft. Previous relief attempts had failed catastrophically. Operation Harpoon from Gibraltar and Operation Vigorous from Alexandria in mid-June saw most merchantmen sunk and escort ships damaged. One of the ships lost was the tanker Kentucky, sister ship to Ohio, crippled by German air attack and finished off by Italian cruisers. Only 2 merchant ships from Harpoon reached Malta. Both were subsequently sunk in harbor with only fractions of their cargoes unloaded. The tanker carrying fuel for Harpoon sank 8 miles from Valletta. Winston Churchill received a cable from the Commander-in-Chief Mediterranean Fleet on June 18th, but expressing doubts about attempting another convoy. Malta had perhaps 10 weeks of supplies remaining. After that, surrender or starvation. The Admiralty planned Operation Pedestal anyway. 3 days before the planning conference at Scapa Flow, a radio message reached Captain Dudley William Mason, master of the tanker Ohio. The message diverted his ship from its intended course. Ohio proceeded to Galveston, Texas, then to Britain. On June 21st, Ohio steamed into the mouth of the Clyde. Mason was 39 years old, the youngest master in the Eagle Oil and Shipping Company fleet. Chosen for this assignment on account of his proven initiative and efficiency and splendid fortitude, he had gone to sea as an apprentice at 17 in June 1920, qualifying as a master mariner at age 30. His father had been a chauffeur. Mason attended school in Long Ditton before joining Eagle Oil, with whom he would remain his entire career. He was compact, efficient, precise in his habits. the sort of officer who kept a camp bed on the bridge because he knew he would not be leaving it for days. Ohio herself was extraordinary. Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Chester, Pennsylvania launched her on April 20th, 1940. She was Hull 190, built for the Texas Oil Company in anticipation of war. Unofficial conversations between American military and oil company officials resulted in the largest tanker built to that date. 9,263 gross register tons, 515 feet length overall, 68-foot beam, 37 feet, 6 inches depth, capacity of 170,000 barrels of fuel oil. Her Westinghouse steam turbine engines developed 9,000 shaft horsepower at 90 revolutions per minute. Connected through double reduction gearing to a single propeller, she was rated for 16 knots. In sea trials, she made 19. No screw-driven tanker had achieved such speed before. Her design incorporated the outward curve of a schooner's bow, bearing influence from old American clipper ships, above and below the waterline. She was a skillful compromise between cargo carrying capacity and speed, balance, and stability. She was never supposed to go to war. The Texas Company built her for commercial service. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt requisitioned her anyway. The British Ministry of War Transport took formal possession of Ohio on July 10, 1942. Administrative management passed to Eagle Oil and Shipping Company, a British subsidiary of Shell. Command passed to Captain Mason. 48 hours later, Mason's crew was complete, 77 men total, 53 British merchant seamen, 24 Royal Navy and Royal Artillery Marine Regiment DEMS gunners to service the weapons. Ohio moved to King George V Dock in Glasgow. The modifications began immediately. She received a 5-inch low-angle gun on her stern, a 3-inch anti-aircraft gun on her bow, 140mm Bofors abaft the funnel, 6 20mm Oerlikons, machine guns, all the armament that could be crammed onto her deck. More critically, she received structural reinforcements. Kentucky's loss in Operation Harpoon had taught a lesson. Kentucky had required only hours of repair work to a steam pipe broken by the force of bomb explosions near her hull. She never received those hours. The Admiralty was determined this would not happen to Ohio. Her engines were mounted on rubber bearings to absorb shock. All steam pipes were supported with steel springs and balks of timber. A system of pipes connected to the ship's compressors, and a new diesel compressor allowing air at 120 pounds per square inch to pressurize any hold tank and blow seawater back out. The work consumed precious days Malta did not have. On July the 29th, Vice Admiral Neville Seifert convened a conference at Scapa for flag and commanding officers of Operation Pedestal. The plan was straightforward in concept, nightmarish in execution. 14 merchant vessels would sail from the Clyde. The convoy designated Force X would receive close escort from 4 cruisers and 11 destroyers all the way to Malta. Force Z, comprising 2 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers with 100 aircraft, 3 cruisers, and 13 destroyers, would provide additional cover as far as the Skirky Channel. 2 oilers and a tug with 4 corvettes accompanied the armada. The carrier Furious with 8 destroyer escorts would use the operation to fly off 40 Spitfires to Malta before returning to Gibraltar. 9 submarines deployed to counter possible Italian surface force movements. The escort totaled 50 warships for 14 merchant vessels. The convoy carried 85,000 tons of supplies and 12,000 tons of fuel. Ohio alone carried between 10,000 and 13,000 tons. Sources varying. Aviation fuel, diesel, kerosene, the lifeblood Malta required to function as an offensive base. Captain Mason briefed his crew in the petty officer's mess. He was direct. Based on the fates of previous Malta convoys, as many as a dozen of the 14 ships would probably not reach the island. Ohio would be the primary target. She carried fuel. She was the largest, most valuable vessel in the convoy. Every Axis aircraft, submarine, and torpedo boat would focus on her destruction. Mason did not ask for volunteers to leave. No man did. The convoy formed up outside the Clyde on the afternoon of Sunday, August 2nd, 1942. Ships steamed in 3 parallel columns. Ohio was 4th in line in the starboard column. The crews learned their destination on the first morning at sea. Additional Oerlikon and heavier anti-aircraft guns had been mounted on the freighter's decks. Royal Navy and Maritime Regiment crews underwent constant exercises. Mason paced the bridge. The camp bed remained folded. The Pedestal ships forged southward through the Bay of Biscay, where U-boats and Focke-Wulf bombers prowled. On August 10th, Axis forces received confirmation that the convoy had passed through the Strait of Gibraltar. 20 submarines, 18 Italian and 2 German, deployed to intercept. The convoy was shadowed from the air. 70 aircraft waited on alert on Sicilian and Sardinian airfields. 18 Italian submarines and 3 German U-boats patrolled between Algiers and the Balearic Islands, off Malta. Throughout the narrows between Sicily and North Africa, German E-boats and Italian motor torpedo boats waited off Cape Bon, where a new minefield had been sown. 3 heavy and 3 light cruisers with 10 destroyers prepared to intercept south of Sicily. The Axis had advance warning. They had time to prepare. They deployed everything available. At 13:15 hours on August 11th, south of Sardinia, the German submarine U-73 torpedoed HMS Eagle. The carrier sank in 7 minutes. 4 torpedoes struck her port side. She listed immediately, rolled, and went down. Ledbury and other escorts recovered survivors, but over 200 men died. Eagle took with her 16 Sea Hurricanes, reducing the convoy's fighter cover. The attacks intensified on August 12th. Wave after wave of German Junkers 88s and Italian aircraft targeted the formation. 4 merchant ships sank during daylight hours. Heavy bombing damaged HMS Indomitable, putting her out of action. The cruiser HMS Cairo lost her stern to a torpedo. The carrier suffered bomb damage that destroyed her flight deck. At 20:35 hours on August 12th, as the convoy entered the Skirky Channel, the Italian submarine Axum launched a spread of torpedoes. Axum's commander had studied the convoy carefully through his periscope, closing to within 4,000 meters. The convoy appeared in 3 lines or wedge-shaped formation with merchantmen in 3 lines, 2 cruisers leading the center, destroyers scattered in an outer screen. The sea was calm, visibility good. At 19:55 hour, Axum fired 4 torpedoes. 3 found targets. The first torpedo struck the cruiser HMS Nigeria amidships, damaging her steering gear and bow. Nigeria would have to return to Gibraltar at 14 knots. The second torpedo struck the anti-aircraft cruiser HMS Cairo aft, blowing off her stern. Cairo was so badly damaged she had to be sunk by British torpedoes and gunfire after survivors were removed. 52 men died aboard Nigeria. The third torpedo struck Ohio amidships on her port side. A pillar of flame leapt into the air. The torpedo blew a hole 24 feet by 27 feet in the port side of the midships pump room. It blew a corresponding hole in the starboard side, flooding the compartment. Burning kerosene bubbled up from fractured tanks. Small gouts of flame spattered the deck up to 30 yards from the blaze. The blast destroyed the ship's gyro compass and knocked the magnetic compass off its bearings. The steering gear was put out of action, forcing the crew to steer with emergency gear aft. Captain Mason ordered engines shut down. All available deckhands fought the fire with deck water lines. James Wild, the chief engineer, kept the boilers running. The fire went out. Ohio's differential gearing, which slowed the propeller automatically when the ship lifted from the water, saved the engines from shaking out of their mountings. On other ships, such an explosion would have destroyed the engine room. The engines restarted. Ohio managed 13 knots after repairs. She steered by emergency gear from aft, using Ledbury's stern light as a compass. She continued with the convoy. This would prove optimistic. At first light on August 13th, the depleted convoy faced renewed assault. Force Z had turned back to Gibraltar at 18:55 hours on August 12th, 20 minutes earlier than planned. Carrier losses reduced the convoy's air cover to 6 Beaufighters from Malta. The convoy was on its own in the narrow waters between Sicily and Tunisia, within easy range of Axis airfields. At 09:15 hours, 16 Junkers 87 Stukas escorted by 8 Messerschmitt 109s and 8 Messerschmitt 110s attacked. 10 Junkers 88s near-missed Ohio. They hit Wimarama, which disintegrated. Aviation fuel on deck burst into flame. 1 bomber was destroyed in the explosion. HMS Ledbury passed through fires, rescuing 27 survivors from Wimarama's complement of 107 men. Wreckage showered Melbourne Star with flaming debris. Ohio survived this attack. Barely. The Stukas returned. Approximately 60 dive bombers focused on Ohio. Near misses buckled her plates. Her forward tank filled with water. The attacks were methodical, professional. Concentrated. Then, something unprecedented occurred. A Junkers 88, hit by anti-aircraft fire, crashed directly onto Ohio's deck. The aircraft exploded on impact. Moments later, a Junkers 87 Stuka bounced off the water and crashed onto Ohio. 2 aircraft, both on her deck, both burning. The crew fought fires while under continuous attack. Ohio avoided torpedoes, circling torpedoes designed to run search patterns, and mines sewn across the channel. 2 bombs straddled her, one on either side. The blast lifted the entire ship clean out of the water. Cascades of spray and bomb splinters lashed the deck. She fell back with a crash that would have broken any normal vessel's back. Ohio's back did not break. Not yet. The engine room lights went out. Master switches thrown off by the force of explosions. An electrician switched them on again. The boiler fires had been blown out. Engineers raced to restore them before steam pressure dropped too low to work the fuel pumps. They lit the fire starter torches, restarted the furnaces. Ohio continued steaming. At 10:50 hours, bombs hit Ohio's boiler room. The explosion wrecked her engine room. She was dead in the water. Captain Mason and Chief Engineer Wild were badly burned. Mason remained on the bridge. Wild remained in the engine room. Neither would leave their posts. HMS Penn attempted to take Ohio under tow. The tanker listed heavily, snapping the tow line. Another bomb struck the same area previously hit by the torpedo. Ohio's keel fractured. Her back broke. The ship began settling by the stern. Mason ordered the crew to abandon ship. Men climbed down into boats. Destroyers came alongside to take off survivors. Ohio sat lower in the water, her stern deck awash. She was finished. Everyone could see she was finished. Except she carried 11,000 tons of fuel. Fuel Malta needed to survive. At approximately 1,300 hours, Lieutenant Commander David Jerome of HMS Penn made a decision. He would get Ohio to Malta, dead in the water, back broken, taking water. Ohio would reach Grand Harbor. Penn took Ohio under tow. The destroyer, HMS Bramham, came alongside to provide stability. Mason and a volunteer crew reboarded the tanker. The tow proceeded at bare steerage way. Ohio wanted to go sideways. The tanker's weight kept breaking tow lines. Through the afternoon and night of August 13th into August 14th, the impossible towing operation continued. Constant air attacks disrupted the formation. 20 bombers focused on Ohio. A bomb destroyed her rudder. Another made a hole in her stern. Her deck sat awash. The towing formation disintegrated and reformed multiple times. Commander Jerome organized yet another attempt. Both Penn and Bramham went slow ahead on either side of the tanker. She began moving forward on a straight course. They worked up to 5 knots. Captain Mason warned his ship would not hold together with any further increase. At that crawl, they continued toward Malta. At noon on August 14th, one of Bramham's wires parted under increasing strain. The tow reformed. HMS Ledbury, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Roger Percival Hill, joined the effort. HMS Rye, a minesweeper, provided additional stability at the stern. At 10:44 hours, 9 Stukas attacked. Ledbury's gunner, manning Ohio's Oerlikon guns, claimed 1 shot down, confirmed by Penn's crew. American volunteers from the sunken merchantman Santa Elisa manned other anti-aircraft positions on Ohio. Junior Third Officer Frederick August Larson, Junior and Cadet Midshipman Francis Dales from the United States Merchant Marine Academy volunteered for this duty. Both would later receive the Merchant Marine Distinguished Service Medal for heroism beyond the call of duty. Malta-based Spitfires arrived, providing air cover, breaking enemy formations before they could press attacks home. But Ohio continued sinking. Water rose in her flooded engine rooms. Her stern sat so low that waves broke across her afterdeck. She was held together now by nothing but her crew's determination and her escort's seamanship. As the towing formation approached Zoncourt Point, Ohio began drifting toward a minefield. Ledbury passed a 6-inch wire to the tanker. Attempting to pull the formation clear, the wire held. They cleared the minefield with yards to spare. Through the night of August 14th into August 15th, 3 tugs from Valletta, Carbine, Coronation, and Robust attempted to join the towing operation. Robust crashed into Penn, holding the destroyer above the waterline. Robust returned to Malta. The destroyers resumed their duties. Ohio was now sandwiched between Penn and Bramham on either side, held together by the destroyer's physical presence as much as by tow lines. Ledbury led the formation. Rye stabilized the stern. The tanker moved forward at perhaps 3 knots, maybe 4. Her back remained broken. Her stern deck underwater, but she moved. At 07:55 hours on August 15th, the formation entered the swept channel into Grand Harbour. A band played Rule Britannia. The music stopped. Silence fell over the harbor. Men removed their hats. Women crossed themselves. A bugle sounded still. The crowd did not cheer. Not yet. They understood what they were seeing. This was not victory. This was survival purchased at terrible cost. Ohio was secured in harbor. Pumps began transferring fuel to the oilers, Boxall and Plumleaf. Salvage crews worked continuously, sometimes under air attack, to create connections to the rapidly sinking tanker. They worked against time and physics. Ohio's keel, fractured in 2 places, could not hold much longer. As the last fuel was pumped from her tanks, Ohio settled on the harbor bottom. Her back broke completely. She split in 2 sections, held together only by deck plating and her sides. She would never sail again. She had delivered her cargo. That was all that mattered. Operation Pedestal cost the Royal Navy and Merchant Navy over 500 lives. Of 14 merchant vessels, only 5 reached Malta. 9 merchantmen sunk. The carrier Eagle sunk. The carriers Indomitable and Victorious badly damaged. The cruisers Nigeria, Kenya, and Manchester damaged or sunk. The destroyer Foresight sunk. Multiple other warships damaged. 32,000 tons of supplies reached Malta. 10,000 tons of fuel, enough to sustain the island for 10 more weeks. Enough for the RAF commander in Malta to report on the evening of August 15th that he could mount unlimited combat sorties for 2 months. The arithmetic remained brutal but shifted in Britain's favor. With fuel, Malta's bombers and torpedo bombers resumed offensive operations. Through August 1942, 35% of Axis convoys to North Africa failed to arrive. In September, Allied forces sank 100,000 tons of Axis shipping, including 24,000 tons of fuel destined for Rommel. He remained desperately short of supplies during his assault at El Alamein on October 26. Malta had not fallen. Malta would not fall. The siege continued into 1943, but Operation Pedestal marked the turning point. The successful delivery of supplies via Pedestal revitalized Malta as an offensive base. Submarines returned. Spitfires flown from Furious during the operation enabled maximum effort against Axis shipping. Captain Dudley William Mason received the George Cross on September 8, 1942. The citation read in part, "The violence of the enemy could not deter the master from his purpose." Throughout he showed skill and courage of the highest order, and it was due to his determination that, in spite of the most persistent enemy opposition, the vessel, with her valuable cargo, eventually reached Malta and was safely berthed. The George Cross is Britain's highest civilian decoration for gallantry. Mason received it not only for his personal courage, but for his crew. Other awards to Ohio's crew included 1 Distinguished Service Order to Chief Engineer James Wild, 5 Distinguished Service Crosses, and 7 Distinguished Service Medals. Lieutenant Commander Jerome of Penn received the Distinguished Service Order. Lieutenant Commander Hill of Ledbury received the Distinguished Service Order after recuperation. Mason was appointed to command the tanker Empire Cobbett, the only British ship to follow American capture of Casablanca in November 1942. After the war, he worked for Eagle Oil as a marine superintendent. Retiring in 1957, he died April 26, 1987, aged 85. Ohio herself settled into the harbor mud. Her broken hull served initially as storage, then as barracks facilities. In September 1946, 4 years after her arrival, what remained of Ohio was towed out to sea and used for naval gunfire practice. She sank in deep water off Malta. Her nameplate, ship's wheel, and ensign are preserved in Malta's National War Museum in Valletta. A few other objects remain in Maltese museums. The rest lies on the seabed. Malta remembers. The convoy is known as Il Convoy to Santa Maria because it arrived on St. Mary's feast day. The Feast of the Assumption, August 15th, a critical holiday in Maltese Catholic tradition. The coincidence of timing was not lost on the deeply religious Maltese population. They had prayed for deliverance. Ohio arrived. The strategic impact of Operation Pedestal extends beyond Malta's survival. The island's continued operation as an offensive base directly contributed to Allied success in North Africa. Rommel's supply situation. already precarious, became untenable. The Second Battle of El Alamein in October and November 1942, which did with Axis forces in full retreat. Operation Torch. The Allied invasion of North Africa commenced November 8, 1942. Malta's continued existence as an Allied base made both operations feasible. Had Malta fallen, the Mediterranean would have become an Axis lake. Supply convoys to North Africa would have operated unmolested. Rommel would have received fuel, ammunition, reinforcements. Egypt might have fallen. The Suez Canal might have fallen. The entire strategic situation in the Middle East and Mediterranean would have shifted decisively in Axis favor. Ohio prevented that. One tanker, one crew, one impossible voyage. The technical specifications seem inadequate to explain what occurred. 9,263 gross tons, 515 feet long, 9,000 shaft horsepower, 16 knots rated, 19 knots a maximum, steel hull with standard merchant vessel construction. These numbers do not capture why Ohio survived torpedoes that sank other ships, bombs that destroyed other vessels, aircraft crashes that should have broken her back immediately. Perhaps the rubber-mounted engines absorbed shock better than anticipated. Perhaps the spring-supported steam pipes prevented catastrophic failure. Perhaps Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company in Chester, Pennsylvania simply built her stronger than required. Perhaps the unofficial conversations between American military and oil company officials produced a vessel more resilient than anyone realized. Or perhaps Ohio survived because her crew refused to let her die. Because Captain Mason would not leave his bridge. Because Chief Engineer Wild kept the boilers running even while badly burned. Because Lieutenant Commander Jerome decided a dead tanker with a broken back could be towed 60 miles through enemy-controlled waters. Because Lieutenant Commander Hill maneuvered a destroyer through minefields in darkness with nothing but determination and seamanship. Because American volunteers from Santa Elisa manned anti-aircraft guns on a sinking ship. Because 77 men looked at an impossible situation and proceeded anyway. They knew Ohio was the only tanker with Malta's fuel. They knew Malta would fall without that fuel. They knew the strategic implications of Malta's fall. They proceeded anyway. The gap between what was expected and what actually happened defines Operation Pedestal. The Admiralty expected heavy losses. They got heavy losses. They also got Ohio into Grand Harbor. Naval doctrine in 1942 did not include procedures for towing a ship with a broken back 60 miles through contested waters while under continuous air attack with the towed vessel physically lashed between two destroyers. That procedure did not exist until Lieutenant Commander Jerome invented it in real time on August 14, 1942. The human cost of strategic success manifests in specific, mounting details. Over 500 Royal Navy and Merchant Navy personnel killed. HMS Eagle, 130 officers and men. HMS Manchester, 70 killed when she was scuttled after torpedo damage. 9 merchant ships sunk with their crews. The men in the water off burning wrecks. The men who died in explosions below decks. The men who drowned, trapped in flooded compartments. The men killed by bomb fragments or strafing or simply by steel failing under impossible stress. Ohio's crew suffered burns, injuries, exhaustion. They abandoned ship twice. They reboarded twice. They remained aboard a vessel that should have sunk, steering by following a destroyer's stern light because their compasses were destroyed. Engines controlled from the bridge because the engine room was flooded. Every man understanding that any moment could bring the torpedo or bomb that would finish them. Captain Mason and Chief Engineer Wild both suffered severe burns that required them to be flown back to England for treatment after Ohio berthed. Neither left their posts while Ohio needed them. Frederick Larson Jr. and Francis Dales volunteered to board a sinking tanker under air attack to man anti-aircraft guns. They were Americans. Ohio flew British colors. They volunteered anyway. The institutional failures that nearly doomed Malta were systematic, not individual. The failure of Operations Harpoon and Vigorous resulted from inadequate escort strength, insufficient air cover, and unrealistic expectations about convoy operations in narrow, contested waters under continuous air attack. The Admiralty learned. Operation Pedestal received 50 warship escorts. It was barely sufficient. The Axis forces demonstrated coordination problems that undermined their tactical successes. Italian submarines operated aggressively, sinking one cruiser and damaging others including Ohio. German and Italian air forces pressed attacks with skill and determination, but the Italian surface fleet, despite possessing 4 battleships, 13 cruisers, and 21 destroyers, remained largely in port. Chronic fuel shortages, only 12,000 tons available in June 1942, and reluctance to engage without guaranteed Luftwaffe cover meant heavier units never sortied. The planned surface attack on convoy remnants was cancelled. Had Italian cruisers and destroyers engaged the depleted escort on the night of August 12th into August 13th, Operation Pedestal might have failed completely. The technological limitations of the era manifest throughout. Ohio had no radar, no sonar. Her anti-aircraft armament was hastily installed and inadequate against mass dive bomber attacks. Her structural reinforcements, rubber engine mounts and spring-supported pipes, were improvised solutions to problems identified only in recent convoy failures. Her towing points were not designed for the stresses imposed by being dragged 60 miles with a broken keel. Yet she held together. The improvised worked where the properly engineered failed. The fog of war operated at every level. Captain Mason could not know if following Ledbury's stern light would lead him into or away from minefields. Lieutenant Commander Jerome could not know if Ohio's hull would hold together under tow. The Admiralty could not know if 5 merchant ships reaching Malta would be enough. The Maltese could not know if Ohio's fuel would arrive in time. Everyone proceeded with incomplete information, making decisions with potentially catastrophic consequences based on limited intelligence and desperate hope. The lessons learned from Operation Pedestal were both absorbed and ignored. The Admiralty recognized that Malta convoys required overwhelming force to have any chance of success. Another large convoy was not attempted until November 1942, after the Second Battle of El Alamein and recapture of airfields in Egypt and Libya made land-based air cover feasible. That lesson was learned, but the broader lesson, that merchant shipping in contested narrow waters required continuous heavy escort and could sustain catastrophic losses even with such escort, appeared to fade. Later convoy operations would demonstrate that institutional memory is fragile. Success breeds complacency. Catastrophe breeds caution. Pedestal bred both. The official narrative, that Operation Pedestal was a costly but necessary victory, emerged quickly and remains essentially accurate. 5 merchant ships reached Malta, delivering 32,000 tons of supplies and 10,000 tons of fuel. This was sufficient to prevent surrender and maintain Malta as an offensive base through the critical autumn of 1942. The cost in ships and lives was severe but acceptable given the strategic imperative. The truth is both simpler and more complex. Pedestal succeeded because individuals made decisions that defied doctrine, procedure, and common sense. They made those decisions because the alternative was unacceptable. Malta could not fall. Therefore, Ohio must reach Malta. The logic was circular, desperate, and ultimately effective. Today, Ohio exists in fragments. Her nameplate in a museum, her wheel on display. Photographs of her final entry into Grand Harbour, sagging between her destroyer escorts, decks awash. Superstructure listing, absolutely wrecked and absolutely triumphant. Film footage shows the silent crowd, the band, the bugle. The moment crystallizes everything the convoy cost and everything it achieved. Malta did not fall. Rommel did not receive supplies. El Alamein succeeded. Torch succeeded. The Mediterranean campaign turned in Allied favor. The war continued. These outcomes can be traced through chains of causation back to August 15, 1942, to a broken tanker entering Grand Harbour on her last voyage. 77 men crewed Ohio, 24 Royal Navy gunners, 53 merchant seamen. Captain Dudley William Mason, Master James Wild, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Commander David Jerome of Penn, Lieutenant Commander Roger Percival Hill of Ledbury. Every man whose name appears in the records and every man whose name does not. The stokers who kept the boilers running, the able seamen who fought fires, the gunners who shot at dive bombers while standing on a sinking deck, the American volunteers who crossed from their own dying ship to help a foreign vessel survive. They refused to let Malta fall. They refused to let Ohio die. When every engineering calculation said she should sink, they got her to harbor. When every tactical assessment said the mission was impossible, they completed it. The tanker that refused to die was really 77 men who refused to quit. The epic of the SS Ohio is the epic of ordinary men performing extraordinary acts not because they were heroes, but because the job required completion, and they were the ones present to complete it. Ohio entered Grand Harbor at 07:55 hours on August 15, 1942. She sank at her berth after discharging her cargo. She saved Malta. That is not legend or exaggeration. That is documented historical fact. 10,000 tons of fuel arrived. Malta's aircraft flew. Axis shipping burned. One ship, one voyage, one impossible journey that succeeded because failure was unacceptable. The Ohio refused to die because her crew refused to let her.